Hey everyone, welcome to this week's edition of Title Scoop. So we are on our final week of missing sellers. As we've discussed the past few weeks, we've talked about the basics, the definitions, and we've talked a little bit about the court action. And today we're going to dive in a little bit deeper on how not to violate due process, what the states have done, and then a little bit more about the administration and what the proper statute is in order to administer an estate of a missing person. So as we discussed a few weeks ago, there was an 1894 case where the Supreme Court basically said, because the person reappeared and you administered the estate under the decedent estate statute, that missing person's due process rights were violated, and in fact, everything had to be unwound. Now, in order to make sure that didn't happen going forward, state legislatures jumped in and they created statutes that allowed them to administer the estates of absentees, which also essentially preserved the property for the benefit of anyone with a right to it, right? So if that missing person, they wanted to protect that interest somehow. Now, to be valid, these statutes have to have 5 different things that I found. Now, again, might be more depending on your state, but I found 5 things in common kind of across the board as far as what would be required in order to make sure there was a constitutional guarantee of due process when there was an absentee property being sold and that person potentially would come back. So the first thing is you have to have a reasonable notice to the missing person. That's going to be outlined in your statute. You're going to want to look at it to make sure that the statute was followed, notice was provided. There has to be a proper inquiry as to the fact of the death of the person, right? So we have to have some proper inquiry as to that. We have to have a reasonable notice to all necessary parties. Now, one thing to remember here is that includes heirs. That's something that sometimes I think would potentially be forgotten because we're looking at a person, right? But you do have to notify those heirs, all legal heirs. So that's something to make sure that you look at if in fact you have one of these files. You also have to have a reasonable time after the disappearance of the missing person, and that has to lapse before they can sell or divest the property. That's really spelled out in every single statute that I saw, and the court will make the determination that that time has lapsed. And last but not least, and probably the most important as to due process, there has to be a safeguard in the statute in place that's followed for the restoration of the property to the absentee in the event that they reappear. Now, what I will say is some states define that as actually giving the property back and some define it as money. So it just depends on what the situation is. Now, when the proceeding commences for this type of situation, the court's going to take control of the property. They're going to keep control of that property until disposition. Now, if the statutory time period for the presumption of death has ended, all right, so we've passed what your state requires, the constitutional guarantee of due process is satisfied as long as we have a decree stating that the person, the time has passed, the person is declared dead, and that there is a financial protection for that missing person put in place, and that would be in that decree. Now, although the person has been absent or unheard of for years, the estate of a missing person has to still follow the administration of an absentee, not the administration of a decedent. And I'm going to say that more than once because it is critical that the right statute is followed. Now, stated before, we've discussed there's important requirements for the protection of due process, and one of those is that safeguard in place with regard to restoration of the property or financial status, right? So states handle that differently and define it differently. I'm going to tell you a couple of different ones that I found. Some states require an indemnifying bond that will guarantee the return of either the funds or the property. That is the case I found in quite a few different states. Some, if you do say the heirs do a partition action, they decide to divide the property or the proceeds of a sale. Well, most of the time, you may have some type of bond have to be put in place for this. So it might be a refunding bond where if that person reappears, the money will essentially be refunded to them. Now, if the statutory time period has not passed for the presumption of death, some states might require a trust fund, and we talked about that last week. Sometimes they're going to require a trust fund or a bond where the money is going to be paid in. Sometimes that can be independent. Sometimes it's going to be paid to the state or the county. So again, very, very state dependent. Now, again, we know there's 2 different proceedings, one when the person's missing and we're taking care of their property, and one where we want to administer their estate. So you just want to make sure that the right one is being followed if, in fact, you are looking at one of these files. Now, remember, and I said this before, and I probably will say it again, the administration has to happen under the estate of absentee or missing persons, not under a decedent estate. So if you have an attorney who has the person declared dead and then they decide to do an estate under the decedent estate statutes, we don't want to take that because it can be found null and void. In case that person reappears, we're going to have the exact same thing that happened in 1894 in the Supreme Court case. If you guys have these and you come across someone where there's a missing person and you need to know what to do, call your underwriter. These are pretty extra hazardous risks. So we're going to want to look at it, see if we can even insure what requirements we'd have and what exceptions we have, and see if we can get the deal done. All right, that's it for missing sellers. If you guys have questions, let me know. Otherwise, we will see you next week.